May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. While church bells rang across Britain and crowds danced in Trafalgar Square, a very different scene unfolded in a sodden field outside Hamburg. The command came softly, almost tenderly, yet it cut through the tension like a scalpel through silk. "Take it slowly." The German women froze, eyes widening in disbelief. They glanced at one another, then at the British soldiers kneeling before them, bowls of steaming soup and spoons held with deliberate care in their hands. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. They had heard the stories, the rumors that spread through the camps, whispers that haunted their nights. They had envisioned the worst, rehearsed the horrors in their minds until dread had become a constant companion. And now, as the British soldiers inched closer, lifting those spoons toward trembling lips, a single thought coursed through the group like ice water through veins. Why are they feeding us by hand? What are they planning to do to us? Stay until the end to understand the devastating truth behind that moment, and why the women's terror transformed into something utterly unforeseen. In the final desperate months of the war, Germany was bleeding from within. The Third Reich, which had promised to endure 1,000 years, had collapsed in barely 12. Cities lay in ruins, reduced to skeletal shadows of their former grandeur. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, great metropolises transformed into fields of rubble and ash. The infrastructure that had once been Germany's pride now consisted of shattered railways, demolished bridges, and roads cratered beyond recognition. Food had become more precious than gold. Civilians clutched ration cards that barely supplied enough calories to survive. Black markets thrived in the shadows, where a loaf of bread might cost a family heirloom, where desperate mothers traded wedding rings for powdered milk. The sophisticated supply chains that had fueled the German war machine for years had entirely collapsed. Warehouses were empty. Farms lay abandoned. Workers were either dead, conscripted, or fled. For the women serving in auxiliary military roles, conditions were even more precarious. They were not combat soldiers, but they had been integral to Germany's war effort nonetheless. They had been clerks, meticulously filing reports in underground bunkers, fingers stained with ink and carbon paper. They had been radio operators, headphones clamped over ears for hours, relaying coded messages they scarcely understood. They had served as flak assistants, anti-aircraft auxiliaries scanning skies for Allied bombers, operating searchlights and early warning systems, loading ammunition for guns that fired desperately at waves of aircraft above. They had marched for days when positions were overrun, sleeping rough in burned-out houses and abandoned barns. Survival depended on whatever they could scavenge: stale bread soaked in water, potatoes more rot than flesh, wild plants of uncertain safety. Some went days without substantial food. Their bodies grew emaciated, faces hollow. Uniforms that had once been fitted now hung loosely on gaunt frames. By the time British forces arrived in those chaotic final weeks, their bodies were fragile vessels of exhaustion. Nerves were stretched taut as piano wire, and trust even among themselves had eroded to almost nothing. They anticipated harsh treatment. Years of propaganda told them the enemy was merciless, that the British were cold and calculating, that punishment would be swift and remorseless. They expected retribution for serving the regime, even in limited capacities. They expected to be treated as the enemy, because that was precisely what they were. Nothing at all, had prepared them for what actually occurred. The women were assembled in silence, corralled into a makeshift gathering area near what had once been a German supply depot. British soldiers advanced with measured care, but without aggression, without malice in their gaze. No shouted commands, no rifle butts swung, no threats delivered with venom. Only calm, steady instructions, sometimes in broken German, sometimes conveyed through interpreters. The women did not trust it. How could they? Kindness from an enemy felt impossible, inconceivable. It contradicted everything they had been taught, everything they had expected. Cognitive dissonance left them dizzy with uncertainty. They were escorted, marched is too strong a word, to a temporary internment camp the British had established with surprising efficiency. Canvas tents stood in neat rows. Medical stations were in place. Latrines were dug at appropriate distances from water sources. Organization was meticulous, almost businesslike. The women received blankets, actual wool, not threadbare scraps, and were told to rest, to take the weight off their feet. But rest was a foreign concept, a luxury impossible to afford. Their bodies trembled from exhaustion, hunger, and fear of what horrors might still come. Some of the younger women wept quietly, trying to mask their tears. Others sat rigid, eyes darting at every movement, every shadow. The older women, those who had endured the aftermath of the First World War, wore grim, resigned expressions, bracing for judgment. Then it arrived on the wind, a scent that made several gasp involuntarily. The aroma of warm, real food. Not the watery gruel they had scavenged, not the moldy scraps fought over, but actual cooked meals with substance. Meat, vegetables simmered in stock, fresh bread warm from the British field kitchens. Some stomachs cramped painfully at the scent, others felt saliva flood their mouths for the first time in weeks. Yet alongside the hunger came a new fear, sharper, deeper, more perplexing than any they had known. British soldiers carried large pots of stew, baskets of bread, containers of hot tea. The women stared at the food with a mix of desperate longing and profound suspicion. Every movement was followed, every bowl watched. Some whispered urgently, terrified, "It's a trick. They want us to drop our guard." Others feared immediate punishment. "If we eat too fast, they'll punish us," recalling harsh lessons from training camps where grabbing food earned reprimands. Beneath these fears lurked something darker. Some suspected poison, imagined secret vengeance, convinced the enemy might quietly finish what the war had started. "Why else would they feed us?" one whispered, her logic twisted by starvation and terror. "We are the enemy. We cost them resources. It would be easier to—" She did not finish. She did not need to. The others understood. As the British soldiers moved from woman to woman, distributing bowls with deliberate care, the response was not gratitude, it was apprehension. Hands reached out tentatively, then pulled back. Some women's hands shook so badly from weakness, from anxiety, from the sheer overwhelm of the moment that they couldn't hold the spoon steady. The utensils clattered against the metal bowls, creating a nervous percussion that echoed through the camp. Others were simply too weak. Days without adequate food had left them with trembling limbs and diminished motor control. Their fingers couldn't grip properly. Their arms lacked the strength to lift even a lightweight spoon repeatedly from bowl to mouth. The British soldiers noticed this immediately. They had been briefed, had been trained, had seen similar situations in other liberated areas. They exchanged glances, some concerned, some sympathetic, all determined. Then they made a decision that the German women absolutely did not understand. The soldiers began to kneel down beside the women. They took the spoons gently from trembling fingers. They dipped the utensils into the bowls, carefully gauging the temperature, the portion size, and then they lifted the spoons toward the women's mouths and spoke words that would freeze every prisoner in place. "Take it slowly, Lancome. Slowly now." The British soldiers leaned in, offering those first spoonfuls by hand, as one might feed a child or someone bedridden with illness. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The women recoiled as if struck. Some physically jerked backward, their backs pressing against whatever was behind them. Others flinched so hard that nearby women started as well, creating a ripple effect of panic. One woman turned her head away entirely, her eyes squeezed shut, her entire body rigid with terror. They didn't know why the soldiers were doing this. The action made no sense within any framework they could comprehend. They didn't know if it was kindness or something else, something far more sinister that their exhausted minds couldn't quite grasp, but their instincts screamed warnings about. Their thoughts raced through a maze of fear and confusion, each turn leading to darker possibilities. Why are they feeding us by hand like this? Are they mocking us? Is this humiliation before something worse? Why do they insist we eat slowly? Are they drawing this out? Do they want to watch us suffer? Is the poison slow acting? Why do they watch us so closely? What are they looking for? What reaction? What sign? The propaganda they had consumed for years roared back to life in their minds. Stories of enemy cruelty, of prisoners abused and degraded, of elaborate psychological tortures designed to break the spirit before destroying the body. Some of the women had worked in offices where reports from the Eastern Front had crossed their desks, reports that spoke of harsh treatment of German prisoners. If the Soviets were brutal, why would the British be any different? The tension in the camp was suffocating. Thick enough to choke on. You could hear it in the shallow breathing, see it in the wide eyes and rigid postures, feel it in the air itself, which seemed to vibrate with collective anxiety. The British soldiers maintained their calm demeanor, but several looked troubled. This wasn't the reception they had anticipated. Some had sisters or mothers back home. Some had wives. Looking at these frightened women, hungry and terrified, stirred something uncomfortable in their chests. But they had their orders, and more importantly, they understood the medical necessity of what they were doing. "Come on now, love," one British corporal said gently to a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19. His Lancashire accent softened the words. "Just a small bite. Won't hurt you. Promise." The woman stared at him as if he was speaking an alien language, which, in a sense, he was. The concept of enemy compassion didn't translate into her experience. Hunger is a powerful force. It's not merely discomfort. It's a Relentless biological imperative that eventually overrides almost everything else, including fear. The human body, when pushed to extremes, will take desperate measures to survive. One woman finally broke. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, old enough to have some perspective, young enough to have strength left. She had been a telephone operator in Berlin, spending long shifts in underground bunkers, connecting calls while the city burned above her. She had gone 3 days with almost nothing but water and a few bites of hard bread. She looked at the spoon being held patiently near her face. She looked at the British soldier holding it, a man with kind eyes and a patient expression, who looked like he might have been a shopkeeper or a teacher before the war. She looked at the other women, all frozen in the same paralysis of fear. Then she made her decision. Survival trumped terror. She opened her mouth just a little, just enough for the spoon to slip past her lips. The soup touched her tongue, warm, seasoned with actual pieces of potato and carrot and even some meat. The taste was so overwhelming after months of deprivation that tears immediately sprang to her eyes. She swallowed. The warmth traveled down her throat, hit her empty stomach, and her entire body seemed to sigh with relief. Nothing happened. No sudden pain, no bitter aftertaste, no immediate collapse, just warmth and nourishment in the first real food she had tasted in longer than she could remember. The British soldier smiled slightly. There you are. Good. Another. Slowly now. Another spoonful. Another swallow. Other women watched this first pioneer with intense focus. When she didn't collapse, didn't cry out in pain, didn't show any signs of distress, something shifted in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it was there. Another woman opened her mouth to accept the spoon being offered to her. Then another, like dominoes falling, one by one, the women began to eat. The British soldiers kept up a steady stream of gentle encouragement, repeating the same phrases over and over. Gently now, small bites, not too fast. Longam, lonesome, that's it. Easy does it. The women's eyes continued to dart around the camp, searching for the trap, waiting for the other shoe to drop, anticipating whatever horror they were certain must be coming. But nothing came. No pain, no cruelty, no punishment. Instead, something else began to happen, something they hadn't experienced in so long they almost didn't recognize it. Their breathing began to steady, the shallow gasps deepening into more normal rhythms. Their shoulders, which had been hunched defensively around their ears, began to lower incrementally. Their hands, which had been bowled into fists, or clutching at their own clothes, slowly relaxed. The fear didn't vanish. That would take much longer, weeks or months for some, but it cracked just enough for something new to slip through. Those fissures, a tiny seed of something that might eventually grow into trust. Only later, after the bowls were empty and the women were resting, truly resting for the first time in days, did the full truth emerge. It came through interpreters, through the few women who spoke some English, through careful explanations from British medical officers who made rounds through the camp. The British soldiers weren't feeding them by hand to control them, to assert dominance, or to humiliate them. They weren't trying to mock their weakness or infantilize them as some form of psychological warfare, and they most certainly weren't trying to poison them. They were trying to save their lives. The women were so severely malnourished that their bodies had entered a dangerous state. Their digestive systems had slowed to a crawl, conserving energy, adapting to starvation. Their blood sugar was dangerously low. Their electrolyte balances were completely disrupted. Their stomachs had shrunk. Their bodies had begun consuming their own muscle tissue for energy, including potentially the muscles of the heart. In this condition, eating too quickly could be catastrophic. It could trigger something called refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal shift in fluids and electrolytes that occurs when nutrition is reintroduced too rapidly to someone who is severely malnourished. The sudden influx of food could cause the body to pull phosphate, potassium, and magnesium from the bloodstream into the cells to process the nutrients. This shift could lead to heart failure, respiratory failure, seizures, or coma. Additionally, their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle normal portions. Eating too much too fast would cause severe cramping, vomiting, and potentially dangerous intestinal blockages. Some women were so weak that even the act of eating, the physical effort required, could exhaust them dangerously if they tried to do it too quickly. The British soldiers had encountered this before. They had been briefed by medical officers who had experience with concentration camp liberations, with freed prisoners of war, with starving civilian populations. They had seen what happened when well-meaning soldiers gave starving people full rations and watched in horror as those people became violently ill or even died from the very food meant to save them. They knew the warning signs, the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the loose clothing on skeletal frames, the yellowed skin, the brittle hair. They knew exactly how serious the situation was, and that was why they had made the decision to feed the women by hand, slowly, carefully. One small spoonful at a time. They needed to control the pace to ensure that the reintroduction of food happened gradually enough that these women's bodies could adapt and accept the nourishment without catastrophic consequences. The order that had sounded so strange, so frightening, so impossible to trust, "Take it slowly," was perhaps the most compassionate command any of these women had received in years. It was the difference between life and death delivered in two simple words. When the truth finally penetrated through the fog of fear and exhaustion, when the women finally understood what had actually happened and why, the reaction was profound. They had expected cruelty. For months, they had been preparing themselves mentally for harsh treatment, for retribution, for the rough justice of victors toward the vanquished. The propaganda had told them the British were vindictive, that prisoners would be treated with the same harshness Germany had shown to its own prisoners. They had expected punishment. They knew they had served the Reich even in minor capacities. They had operated the communications that coordinated military movements. They had helped operate the defenses that had shot down Allied aircraft with crews who had families waiting for them to come home. They expected to answer for that service, to pay some price for their part in the war machine. They had expected to be treated as the enemy because that's precisely what they were. Enemy combatants, enemy auxiliaries, women who had worn German uniforms and served German interests. Why would the British see them as anything else? Instead, they had been treated as human beings, as people in desperate need, as individuals whose lives had value, even though they had been on the opposite side of the war. The British had fed them carefully, patiently, gently, not because it was easy or convenient, but because their lives depended on it. The soldiers had knelt in the mud beside them. They had taken time from their own duties. They had handled spoons and bowls and measured out portions with meticulous care. They had spoken gently when they could have spoken harshly. They had shown patience when they could have shown indifference. The fear that had filled the camp at the beginning of that meal, the terror that had made women recoil from offered food, slowly transformed into something else entirely. It was a complex mixture of emotions that would take weeks to fully process. Relief, profound and overwhelming, that they had survived not just the war, but also its immediate aftermath, that they were safe, at least for now. Gratitude, hesitant at first, but growing stronger for soldiers who had cared enough to protect them from themselves, from the danger that their own hunger posed. Disbelief that the people they had been taught to fear, to hate, to see as the existential enemy were the very ones keeping them alive. It challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Shame for some at having believed the worst, at having feared kindness, at having been so thoroughly deceived by the propaganda they had consumed. Confusion because reconciling this reality with years of indoctrination was mentally and emotionally exhausting. And underneath it all, a fragile, tentative sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the future might not be as dark as they had feared. The feeding protocol continued for several days. The British medical officers monitored the women closely, tracking their recovery, adjusting portion sizes gradually as their bodies adapted. The progression was careful and calculated. Small amounts of warm broth and soft bread fed slowly under supervision. Slightly larger portions. Introduction of mashed vegetables, continued supervision, but some women were deemed stable enough to feed themselves with guidance. More varied nutrition. Careful introduction of protein. Most women now eating independently, but still under watchful eyes. Day 4 and beyond. Gradual return to normal portions, though still well below what a healthy person would eat. Continued monitoring for any signs of complications. Throughout this process, something remarkable happened. The initial terror that had defined the first encounter began to dissolve. Not completely. Trust takes time to build, especially when it has been thoroughly destroyed, but incrementally, interaction by interaction, meal by meal. The women began to speak to the British soldiers tentatively at first. A few words of gratitude in broken English, questions about what would happen to them, small requests. Could they write to their families? Did anyone know what had happened to Hamburg? Was the war truly over? The soldiers responded with patience and whatever information they could share. Some brought cigarettes to distribute. Others played gramophones in the evening so there could be music. A few organized games for the younger women. Simple things like cards or makeshift football with rolled-up cloth. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some women remained deeply traumatized, struggling to accept kindness from those they had been taught to fear. Some were dealing with grief for lost family members, destroyed homes, a country that no longer existed in the form they had known. But overall, a shift occurred. What happened in that field outside Hamburg was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, British forces encountered thousands of German military personnel, both men and women, in various states of distress and malnutrition. The British Army had learned hard lessons about how to handle mass populations of displaced, defeated, and often desperately hungry people. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945 had been a horrifying education in what happens when starving people are given food too quickly. Despite the best intentions of British soldiers who opened their own rations to give to the emaciated prisoners, many died from the sudden reintroduction of rich food to systems that couldn't handle it. The medical officers who responded to that crisis developed protocols specifically to prevent such tragedies from repeating. These protocols were then applied across various situations to concentration camp survivors, to prisoners of war, to civilian refugees, and to captured German military personnel. The approach was the same. Assess the level of malnutrition, introduce food slowly and carefully, monitor for complications, and gradually increase portions as the body adapted. It was a massive logistical undertaking. The British Army was dealing with millions of displaced persons across occupied Germany. They had to establish order, provide security, begin the process of denazification, and somehow feed vast numbers of people whose infrastructure had been obliterated. That they took the time and care to do this properly, even for enemy combatants, speaks to both military discipline and a fundamental sense of humanity that survived even the brutality of 6 years of total war. In the decades after the war, some of these women shared their stories. Their accounts preserved in archives and oral histories provide a window into that extraordinary moment. I thought they would beat us, one woman recalled in an interview conducted in the 1970s. I thought at best they would ignore us and let us starve. When that British soldier knelt beside me with that spoon, I was convinced it was poisoned. I was certain I was about to die. When the food was real and I survived, I didn't know what to make of it. I had to reconstruct my entire understanding of the world. Another woman, a former radio operator in Bremen, recounted in her memoirs, "The gentleness was what shocked me most. We had been told the British were cold and mechanical, but the soldier who fed me, his hands trembled almost as much as mine. He looked concerned. He called me dear in English. I didn't understand it then, but later someone explained, he was worried about me. About me, who had been his enemy. I carry that memory with me always." A third account, from a woman who had operated searchlights for anti-aircraft batteries, reflected, "I realized later that they saved my life that day. If they had simply handed us food and walked away, if they had allowed us to eat as fast as we could, I would have gorged myself. I would have eaten until I was sick, perhaps until I died." They knew this. They knew us better than we knew ourselves in that moment. That sort of care from an enemy altered something deep within them. The command, "Take it slowly," became a defining moment in their lives. It marked the collision between expectation and reality so starkly that it forced a profound re-evaluation. They had been taught that the enemy was inhuman, that defeat would bring unspeakable horrors, that capture meant annihilation. Instead, defeat brought carefully rationed soup. Capture meant medical oversight. The enemy had medics aware of refeeding syndrome, and soldiers who would kneel in the mud to ensure prisoners ate safely. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between anticipated cruelty and received care, was profound. It sowed doubt about everything else they had been told. If the propaganda about the British was false, what else might be false? If the enemy could show such humanity, What did that suggest about their own side's treatment of prisoners and occupied peoples? For some, this initiated a long reckoning with what the right truly was, what it had done, and what they had participated in, however peripherally. The kindness exhibited by British soldiers in those first desperate days became a touchstone, a moment of clarity amid the haze of propaganda and denial. This experience also resonated with the British soldiers themselves. Many were young men hardened by years of combat. They had seen comrades die, stormed beaches, and liberated concentration camps whose horrors would haunt them for life. They could have justified hostility toward all Germans, including these auxiliary women. The temptation to harden rather than show compassion must have been strong, yet they chose empathy. Some soldiers wrote home, their letters revealing a blend of relief that the war had ended, pride in victory, and a weary sadness at Germany's condition. One corporal wrote to his wife, "We're feeding German prisoners today, mostly women. They're terrified of us. It's strange to be feared like this when all we're doing is offering soup." Makes you think about what they've been told about us. Makes you reflect on what we've been told about them, too. They're just people, love, afraid, hungry people. War turns us all into monsters, I suppose. But underneath, we're still just people. This true story, preserved in military records, oral histories, and personal accounts, illustrates something essential about human nature and the choices we make in dire circumstances. Wars produce rigid divisions, us versus them, friend versus foe, good versus evil, necessary for armies to function, for soldiers to follow orders, for nations to mobilize. Yet such divisions can obscure shared humanity. The British soldiers who fed those women, kneeling in mud and patiently ensuring each spoonful was safely consumed, who reassured and attended to individuals who had every reason to fear them, chose to see humans rather than mere enemies. The German women, forced to overcome years of propaganda and immediate terror to accept this kindness, rebuilt their understanding of the world based on this unexpected mercy. They learned that enemies could become saviors, that defeat could bring protection, that sometimes the darkest hours precede light. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. While celebrations erupted across Allied nations, in a muddy field outside Hamburg, a small group of German women learned a profound lesson about humanity, compassion, and the unlikely places where mercy can appear. The command, "Take it slowly," initially terrifying, became the moment they realized they were in safe hands. The people they had been taught to fear had become their guardians. The enemy had become their protectors. This is a verified World War II story, preserved in first-hand accounts, documented in military records, and remembered by both the women who experienced it and the soldiers who provided it. It reminds us that even in total war, in societal collapse, when vengeance and cruelty seem inevitable, humanity can prevail. Sometimes mercy arrives from the most unexpected source. Sometimes the enemy is the one who saves your life. Sometimes a simple command, "Take it slowly," becomes the instant everything changes. The women who lived it never forgot it. Neither did the soldiers who enacted it. It endures as a testament to the potential for compassion, even in the most unlikely circumstances, a reminder that all humans are capable of both cruelty and extraordinary kindness, and that the choice of which path to follow, even in the darkest moments, remains ours alone.